Youth crime in Queensland today. We're approaching the state election here in Queensland, and as usual, parties on both sides are hyping up the fear about youth crime. The opposition, whichever party that happens to be at the time, always shouts most loudly about this, of course. But the government of the day will also proclaim about how tough they are on crime and youth crime in particular. If I were to stop anyone in the street, anyone at all, I can almost guarantee that they would say we have a youth crime crisis in Queensland today and probably across the whole of Australia. And yet, well, according to a report posted on the ABC website, that's Australia's ABC, not the one in the US. I'll post a link to it below. According to this report, this simply is not true. There is no youth crime crisis. Criminologists in Queensland are unanimous that 1. There's no youth crime crisis, and 2. That harsher penalties will not decrease youth crime. Claims made by both major political parties and believed by almost everyone. In fact, across the board in Australia, the youth crime rate has been falling significantly since 2008-9. Now these are, of course, per capita figures, per 100,000 in fact. Fewer youths per capita are committing crimes. Note how that's dropped steeply compared to the adult crime rate. Associate Professor Renee Zanow of the University of Queensland said, "Whilst the population has continued to grow, we've actually seen the number of offences stay the same or decrease in certain areas." Australian Bureau of Statistics data shows that Queensland's youth crime rate has halved across the past 14 years. Data from the Queensland Police Service, the Queensland Statisticians Office and the Australian Institute of Criminology also demonstrate clear downward trends. Youth crime rates have fallen in every single state and territory, including Queensland, which remains somewhere in the middle of the pack with the fourth highest rate. Quite clearly, the proportion of crime committed by youths in Australia has decreased from 18% in 2008-9 to 13% in 2022-3. Not only that, but the absolute number of total offenders fell from 90,748 in 2008-9 to 82,677 in 2022-3. In 2022, Queensland youth crime hit the lowest rate in recorded history and has remained steady ever since then. There are certain to be occasional and local fluctuations, which of course proponents of the idea that we're in the midst of a youth crime wave will pounce upon, much the same way that climate change denialists will pounce on any slight fall in the Earth's temperature amidst a long-term trend of increase. As for harsher penalties, according to criminologists again, the idea that harsher penalties will reduce youth crime is a big lie. In fact, Griffith University criminologist Ross Hommel says that the opposite has been repeatedly demonstrated through twin studies, randomised controlled trials, natural experiments and longitudinal studies. I quote, "Criminal justice processing of juveniles is itself a cause of future offending. It doesn't make the community safer. It fails to address the underlying causes of youth crime." Furthermore, he claimed that there was a wrong perception that judges were becoming more lenient over time, when the opposite was in fact true. Australian Bureau of Statistics data shows that the country's imprisonment rate had increased to record highs, especially among prisoners who had not yet received a sentence. The number of unsentenced prisoners who had been refused bail doubled in 10 years, from 7,375 in 2013 to 15,937 in 2023, the highest in history. Of course, you can ask the question here, is what in fact seems to be a regime of tougher penalties actually responsible for the decrease in crime rates among youth and in crime overall that we're witnessing? If you answer yes to that question, you have to admit that the youth crime rate has, in fact, been steadily decreasing for years. If you answer no to that question, but maintain that the youth crime rate continues to increase, you have to accept that tougher penalties don't work. I suspect, of course, that if someone wants to continue believing that the youth crime rate is out of control, they will simply deny both lines of evidence. They'll deny that youth crime has decreased, and they'll deny that penalties have become harsher. Which brings us to the question, why do people continue to believe that the youth crime rate is increasing despite all evidence to the contrary? I can think of 4 reasons for this. First is the media. Youth crime obviously makes for interesting, eye-catching stories. It pulls in the viewers and the advertisers. Fortunately, the ABC doesn't have advertisers, at least. Second, of course, is the politicians, particularly, as we always see, at election time. A tough stance against youth crime is always seen as a vote winner. The next 2 reasons are slightly more psychological than even biological. And in fact, I think they're fueled by the previous 2 reasons. So the third reason is personal experience. If you're the victim of a crime yourself, naturally this looms large in your experience. It can dominate your thoughts and your emotions and distort your perceptions. The fact that this has happened to me makes it much more important in the scheme of things. This can lead to perception bias. I remember when someone, young people in fact, broke into a friend's home during the night. A horrific and terrifying experience, obviously. My friend said that she'd subsequently joined a Facebook group that kept people apprised of youth crime in the area. I strongly advised her to get out of that group because it would magnify the extent of the problem and the fear associated with that problem out of all proportion. That was a long time ago now, and I don't know whether she followed my advice. Contrary to what people think, a direct personal experience such as this doesn't give you a better perspective. It gives you a very skewed and distorted perspective. That's not a good position from which to be advocating for or deciding society-wide policy. Unfortunately, people will believe their own experience rather than any evidence produced by experts. Indeed, you can hear already those apostrophes going around that word. Furthermore, groups can coalesce around victims of crime. A non-victim group is unlikely to form. These groups are held together by shared experience, they reinforce the perspective of the individual, and they amplify their emotions. The appearance of such groups gives the impression that the problem is larger than it actually is. It also gives this particular point of view a loud and unified voice, which, I would suggest, is out of proportion to the extent of the problem. It's not my intention to minimise or belittle the experience of people who've been affected directly by crime like this, but I don't think it provides a very strong foundation on which to build public policy. The fourth and final point I want to make here concerns something I mentioned in passing a moment ago, and that is fear. Of course, being a victim of crime is terrifying. Even believing that you're surrounded by youth crime can give rise to fear. How do you feel when you're walking down the street and you see a gang of youths approaching? No offence to the brilliant Australian band by that name. Well, you feel fear, right? Especially at night. Once this fear is triggered, it's very difficult to shift. And it's even worse when the fear is caused by something rather vague and nebulous. Fear is triggered in the amygdala, and this then triggers the fight-flight response. This is fine when you bump into a lion in the Serengeti, but it's not so useful when the threat seems to be all around you, but you can't quite pinpoint it and there's nowhere to run to. This fear can become somewhat chronic, and once this fear response is triggered, it's pretty difficult for the frontal cortex of the brain to regain control, especially if the threat can't be resolved. Rational thought goes out the window. Which is why I suggest that anyone who believes that we're currently in the midst of a youth crime wave, especially if they've been a victim of crime themselves, will not be moved even 1 centimetre by the facts that I've attempted to present today in this video.